You're listening to the Sketchnote Army Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rohde, the author of the Sketchnote Handbook and the Sketchnote Workbook. And this is the podcast where I chat with sketchnoters and visual thinkers and try to understand what makes them tick. Hey everyone, it's Mike Rohde and I'm here with Scott Young. Scott, welcome to the podcast. It's so good to have you.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So Scott, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do so we have an idea.
Yeah, so I have been a blogger for like 15 years. I have a website, scottyoung.com, where I write about learning and productivity and just, generally how to think about living life. And I guess maybe the thing I'm most known for is I've done some learning projects that got some attention. So one of them I called the MIT Challenge, where I was trying to learn MIT's computer science curriculum over 12 months. I did another one where I went with a friend and we traveled to 4 countries learning 4 different languages. And I've even done one about art. So I did a portrait drawing challenge, trying to get better at drawing faces over 30 days. And this kind of all culminated in a book 3 years ago I published called Ultralearning, which was not just about my stories, but lots of other people who've done really interesting feats of learning difficult skills in short periods of time or through unconventional means, and trying to pair that up with the cognitive science of learning. So what we know about how learning works from scientific experiments, so that hopefully, if you want to learn something better or you want to understand the process of getting good at things, you have some tools and some ideas at your disposal.
That sounds like a great book and something that I'd be very interested in. I think the audience would love to be interested in. Can you talk just for a minute about the book itself and how would you describe it and where can people find it?
Yeah, so the book is split into these 9 principles, which are kind of, again, paired up with stories of people who have, learned something really difficult or learned something particularly well as some cognitive science research. So some of these things are, they were surprising to me when I first read them. So one of them that I think is underappreciated is this idea of retrieval, which is that when you are trying to remember something, it's much more effective to practice remembering it, like actually closing the material and trying to remember it from within, than to just repeatedly look at it, which is how a lot of students study. But there's also ideas related to more sort of visual artistic endeavors as well. I have a section on Richard Feynman, the great Nobel Prize winning physicist, and how he was using a lot of mental imagery in understanding physics and understanding these kind of spatial relationships. And so I think, there's definitely, depending on whether you're trying to study for a test or just want to, be a better thinker, I think there's a lot there in the book.
Now, do you sell that on your website? Is it available in bookstores? What's the best place to get it?
Yeah, it's published through HarperCollins, so you can get it on Amazon, bookstores. I mean, it's not, it's probably not in every airport bookstore, but I'm sure you could find it if you wanted to look for it. It's Audible too, so if you want to listen to me for like 6 hours, you can also listen to it.
That's fantastic. That's great.
Yeah.
And I think this audience, so we're really into learning and exploring and experimenting. Yeah. So this sounds like a perfect book for anybody in the sketchnoting community listening to pick up a copy and check out. So this is really great. And the thing I'll mention, so a past guest, Zena Gooding-Broderick, reached out to me and said, hey, I've got this guy that's really interesting. I think he would be a good guest on the Sketchnote Army podcast, because she was on the podcast and talked about her journey. So I just I took your name, I looked at your podcast, and I think for some reason I looked you up on Google and a video popped up. So I watched the video. We think it was there was like a 5-step learning process, and I watched it. I said immediately, I think I watched 30 seconds. I said, okay, you have to be on the show, because what you're talking about really aligns with sketchnoting. This idea of using visualization techniques and learning, and like all this stuff is sort of in our wheelhouse, I guess. So thank you for being on the show. And I guess, if you wanted to talk a little bit about your origin story, like how did you end up where you are now, writing books and teaching this method, having courses? I think these origin stories are always fun for me to hear. So,
well, I started out blogging actually even in my senior year of high school. I was just before graduating when I decided okay, I'm going to fire up a blog. And this is like 2006. So this is like sort of this weird Wild West frontier of internet blogging, when it was just like, me and a bunch of other weirdos who just like setting up a website and like, I'm going to just share my thoughts. And I was very interested in like self-improvement, having good habits and these kinds of topics at the time. But obviously, being like, an 18-year-old, and I was like, no, I have no life experience. I have really nothing like useful to share to people. But I was spending a lot of time studying. I was spending a lot of time learning. And so I think this was just sort of a natural topic for me to gravitate toward was, well, how do you study? How do you, focus on doing that? So that was a very big part of the early writing that I did in the blog was about some of these topics. And it's funny, I know that visualization and, sketchnoting and stuff is so important to you, but the process of visualizing things, kind of linking things through visual metaphors was like very early on was something that I was writing about, because I think I've always kind of been a visual thinker. I think I'm someone who I like pictures. I think of ideas as pictures. I think of, how would I draw that as a graph? And I think especially with abstract concepts. So I know some people are very concrete in their visualization. So, if you're imagining like some anatomical diagram, you can imagine it. But for me, it's always been the abstract ideas that there's some concrete picture in my head of what that looks like that I reference when I'm thinking about things. And so this was a very big part of my early writing. I sort of call this holistic learning, this idea of just sort of learning things through connections and sort of visual metaphors. And, it's probably naive in some ways from a scientific standpoint, but I think there was a lot that is probably still true in just that we are kind of visual creatures. And so the more you can take something that's abstract, that's symbolic, that's like math or physics or something, and have some concrete mental picture in your head of this is what's happening, I think that's very important. And so I think training yourself to do that, I think it takes some time and it takes some work, but I think that's something that can really expand your thinking tools, especially given that our culture is so maybe verbal. It's a lot more based on writing and reading and words. I think, sometimes it comes a little unnaturally. Like we're very used to like write an essay to explain an idea. But very rarely have you been assigned to like draw a picture to explain this concept. And so I think it's just a set of mental tools that we're just not as familiar with using.
That's really interesting. And so now primarily the things you're doing are running your business, probably teaching based on the book and doing visits, I suspect, on podcasts and shows. And what kind of things are you doing these days that keep you busy and keep you interested?
Well, I mean, I'm very interested in ideas, and I would like to write more books. And so I've been sort of engaged in this big research project recently about some of the kind of foundations of like cognitive science and how people learn things and how people, acquire skills that they apply in real life. And so this has been something that's, excuse me, that's been a big focus of mine. And I think really, I've been an essayist, so I like writing, 2,000 word essays. And it's funny, we were talking about this, but like, it wasn't always the case that I was doing a lot of illustrating for the blog, but starting about 3, maybe 4 years ago, I just very happenstance decided, okay, you know what, I'm going to start doing like a few little doodles for the blog. And they really were just doodles, and they were very much placeholders. And I was thinking in my head, well, this will do for right now until we get someone who's actually like a professional to do these drawings. And to my surprise, people really liked them. And, it's been something that is, to my amusement, I get like tons of emails asking me, like, how do you do the images and how do you do like, and it's always just kind of like, I know that they're not at like a professional standard, but I think it's been something that's been enjoyable to my audience, because I feel like people just enjoy reading so much more when there's some visualization of the ideas. And I think there's often a real benefit, even if they aren't super professional images, to the fact that like I have a verbal description of some mental picture in my head, and then I draw a picture as well, and they're coming from the same source, as opposed to, an essay that's written by someone, but then someone totally different who maybe doesn't know the same topics and stuff is trying to like read the essay and draw what they're writing. I think there is something beneficial there. So, we can definitely get into that as well. But the path for, now every time I publish an essay, I have like 3 or 4 little images. So I've probably drawn like, I don't know, 1,000 images now in the last 4 years on the blog of these little doodles. So yeah.
From placeholder to required element. That's pretty cool. And, I mentioned something before, and that was, I think there's something about when you draw it yourself, not only do people know that you drew it, and there's all those benefits that you say, but I think the fact that it looks human, we we live in such a polished, perfected world where, I think about like Instagram or TikTok or any of these, people aren't showing you their worst days. Like this morning, I dropped we get this water bottle delivery, and the water bottle broke and gushed out everywhere. And I had to like flip it over and pour it into, like, I'm not going to do an Instagram post about me breaking a water bottle, right? Nobody wants to see that. Yeah. And so what happens is a lot of what we see is like the best of everything and the perfect and the amazing sunsets. But that's not always reality. And it doesn't feel
color corrected and airbrushed and yeah.
So I think having something not only that you've done, which ties it even further into your work, but also that it's human and it's not perfect and it's your visual language makes it even more attractive. There's something attractive about the humanness that I think is also embedded into sketchnoting too. It's as someone practices and does this work, their style starts to come through. They develop a style by simply working. And I think, that's also attractive too, I think, because when I see certain people's work, I could spot it a mile away, like, oh, that's so-and-so, or such and such, right? It's because they developed a style, and it's a human style, but it's almost like a signature to them as well.
It's so funny you say this, because like I remember it was on Twitter somewhere, and someone had used one of my images in a thing. Like they had like taken it from its context and used it in something. And I draw a lot of images, so it's not like there's like 4 images that I reuse over and over again. And someone just tagged me on Twitter. They're just like at Scott H. Young, just sort of like, oh, that looks like a Scott H. Young drawing. And so it was just like talking about having a style. Like I feel like, I was doing stick figures in part because just stick figures are just much faster to draw. And if you're doing like 4 or 5 images, it can get a lot more. But there's like a certain, definitely you can, like, I think now if you were familiar with my work and you saw a random image, like, oh yeah, that's something that Scott drew. And I think also I do it all on paper. I know that we can talk about, like, I'm not trying to be anti-digital here, but I think there's something about doing it with paper that also prevents a certain amount of perfectionism. I was just saying how, like, when I first got into it, one of my team members was like, well, you should really like use like Procreate or Photoshop or one of these digital tools for drawing it, because you can get a level of precision you can't get with you can fix mistakes and change colors and do this kind of thing. But I'm actually kind of glad that I didn't go down that path, because otherwise I might be spending like hours like perfecting this image. Whereas because I have to do it in one go, and because the style that I have, I don't use like rulers or this kind of thing. It all has to be kind of freehand. Like you have to sort of do it in one go. You kind of have to just do it. And like, if you make a mistake, you can redraw, but it's not belabored, I guess I could say. Like, it's not something that I'm overdoing. And I think that also contributes to the style a little bit as well, that because of the constraint of the medium, I'm not, spending 3 hours on each drawing, which I think could really impede just getting the stuff out there and just actually producing it, which I think that kind of perfectionism, I think, is especially damaging when you're just getting started, because you have like a real anxiety about how your pictures look. So the more that you can just like erase and go back over and erase and go back over and erase, like you just spend so much time trying to create a work of art that you don't actually convey the idea that you wanted to.
So there's like a pragmatism or practicality in the work you're doing as well, right? Which is really great, because it serves a function, right? It's representing the ideas visually, but it's not like you would necessarily hang it in a gallery, although maybe somebody would, I don't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's like, especially for this kind of writing where the images are not just to be like nice looking images, but they are to help illustrate a point. I think that can be very helpful. I have an editor now, and the way we work is that, like, I write the essays as a draft, then she edits them and then they go up. And she'll frequently tell me that, like, once the images are up there, like, it makes more sense of what I was saying, because it just provides this, other modality for, like, I was talking about an idea and it was like, I'm sort of getting you from the text, but now I can like really see what you're talking about from the images. And so I definitely think this whole idea of using visualizations to convey ideas is definitely very powerful, but I think it's also just useful for thinking about ideas and learning them.
Maybe. So while we're on this topic, let's talk a little bit more about that, because with your background in ultra learning, I suspect this is some aspect of the learning that you talk about. how would you, let's talk a little bit about I guess, overlapping, crossing, learning and visualization. How do you see those two working together in a way? Our audience is a lot of people who do sketchnoting either personally, or they might do something professionally where they're doing it for a customer or client. And this is all kind of what we do. Like, we try to understand things that we're hearing and convert them into understandable concepts or metaphors. I would love to hear like what you think about that, and what are maybe some best practices that we could learn from you.
So I think for starters, the role between visualization and memory particularly, but learning generally has a long history. So, I mean, even the ancient Greeks, they would memorize speeches using this method of loci, which is just you kind of walk through a familiar visual space and then you associate visual images. And the thing is that our ability to remember concrete visual images and physical spaces is quite well developed. It's probably the ancestral memory system. And so our ability to memorize abstract things is significantly worse than our ability to memorize that. And so often if you have like some list of things that you need to memorize, use this method of loci, you walk through some visual space and you associate each of the items. You can memorize a list of like 20, 30 items in one go, and you have it memorized. Now, this is it's an important memory technique. I don't want to say that it's, not useful, but I think where I tend to lean more heavily on is where the visualization incorporates some of the structure of the idea. So it's not just like a superficial, memorizing a grocery list type of task, but where the image actually allows you to think with and work with the idea. So if you're thinking about something like in physics, for instance, let's say you're learning like how to do electrical circuits, right? That's like a common one. And so what is voltage, right? Well, it's like the V on some sort of stick diagram. So maybe they are even using some sort of ideas there, but you don't have a real sense of what it is. And that kind of unreality of it allows you to, let's say, do some calculations. You're moving around the letters and you get an answer that's like totally physically impossible. But just because you were following the rules, you sort of maybe you made a mistake, but you followed the rules and you got to that point, and then you're like, okay, that's the answer. And visual metaphors can be really helpful here because they let you see what the idea is. So, if you think of, this is not an invention of mine, but the idea of voltage is related to height in gravity. And so if you think of the circuit as being like troughs of water, where like the batteries are pumping the water up to a higher point and the resistors are going down a pipe, you have now this sort of like visual metaphor of like, this is what the circuit is, right? This is what it's doing. And so I've always been a big fan of visualization in that way, where it's not a superficial connection of like two ideas that just, sound like each other. And so you're linking them in a kind of arbitrary fashion, but that the visual metaphor is in some sense what the reality really is. And if you have that mental picture, then you can interact with it and see it in a way that if you were to just sort of like learn the explicit, rules for manipulating the symbols, you would not necessarily be able to get that understanding. And so I think this is true for a lot of subjects that people find difficult: mathematics, economics, physics, biology, where if you can visualize it, if you can have an actual image of what's happening in your head, especially when the idea is abstract, that's super powerful.
That's really interesting, that specifically. So I've heard of the memory palace before. I think is that what the loci is? Same idea. Yeah. That's always fascinated me. And I think that I actually use that as far as remembering things. So when I go to an environment, I remember things by their location and I assign information to that. So when I get in that location, I'm like, oh, that's right. And there's a donut shop around the corner, whatever the thing is, right? Like I sort of stack information based on location. And then the second thing that was really fascinating, you talked about visualizing electricity as a physical thing, as troughs of water that need to be pumped, right? So you're now applying physical physics, I guess, or gravity and all these things that we relate to every day to this abstract concept, which we can't really see, but yet is real, just as real as the physical things, right? So I guess I think this is not I think people who
are really good at physics would just be like, well, yeah, duh. Because no, it's funny because you talk to people like this and it's like, oh yeah, well, of course that's what voltage is. Like, of course it's like, it's the electrical equivalent to height. And so of course they're being, batteries are pumping up and resistors are, they even use that visual metaphor when they're talking about it. They'll be like, a stepping down the voltage. Well, what's down, right? It's obviously an analogy to height, right? And so my point is not that I'm inventing this or I'm having some sort of like crazy breakthrough, but just that people who are good at physics, this is what they're doing. Yeah. Is that they have this visual image that they're inspecting. And that's why when they're looking at something, I got a student emailing me about, it was again also in like electromagnetism, but it was some physics assignment, and it was some complicated array of physical forces and things like this. And they were sort of like, figure out what's the correct answer to the situation. And he was really puzzling it. He's like, I can't figure out what it is. And it's like, the answer was obvious because like, well, all in the situations, all the forces balance except for like one in one of the pictures. And so it's like, well, this one it's not the same as the other ones based on this kind of visual idea. And so, I mean, there is a certain mysterious quality to this, but I think at least if you can get the idea of, I'm trying to get an image in my head, help me get an image in my head to a teacher, to a peer, to someone of the material, you've narrowed down the problem considerably, as opposed to just like, well, you just have to learn it. And then you're just like, memorizing it and just trying to come up with the answer. And so I think that's the process of coming up with the image can be tricky. Like it helps to obviously have someone tell you that voltage is the, electrical analog to height, and that, resistors are constraining the kind of downward motion of the force and the batteries are pumping it up. And I mean, and then you get to areas where the analogy doesn't work, where you have things like induction coils and there's magnetism. Like, okay, well, that doesn't work that way. But at the same time, I think that if you can kind of narrow it down to, I'm looking for visual metaphors to understand things, you can often find them. And I really enjoy YouTube channels like 3 Blue 1 Brown, where they do that with like he does that with really complicated math concepts, but he does these like beautiful visualizers and they follow along. And you're like, if this had just been written as a math textual description, I would know what the heck you're talking about. but he can talk about like, like how neural networks work or how Bitcoin works or all these things in a visual language where it's sort of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. What I'm seeing, that makes sense. And so I think that there is definitely a skill that people who are successful with really abstract subjects, they're able to translate it into a picture that they're able to manipulate in their head. And so I think that's quite powerful as a thinking tool to like get used to thinking of ideas in a visual way.
So maybe the last question I'll have around this is, you mentioned, we'll go back to the blog posts that you write, your essays, and then you do visualization to support them. Can you talk a little bit about your process and how you come by images? Are they already in your head?
Yeah.
Do they come from the text? Is the text driven from the images? I could see that being valuable to someone who's listening to sort of get into your process and thinking to maybe replicate it.
I'm definitely a writer first. So I usually write the essays, but I think the images often come along with it. And as I said, like this is a kind of mental habit that whenever I'm talking about something really abstract, some people like to go to analogy. So very often, in a verbal format, you'll see that kind of literary type of analogy where you're going from an abstract domain and then you're describing it using words in another familiar domain. But I very often go from an abstract, like symbolic domain to an abstract visual domain. So that's sort of my thinking, is that I like graphs and I like, colored spheres and things that like move and stuff. And so they're also abstract. If you described them in words, you wouldn't be any further away from what you're doing before. But as soon as you can draw a picture, sometimes you can represent it. And so, we were even talking, I have this is just like proof that I do it on paper here. One of the drawings I have here, and this is from, the people who are listening right now can't see this, but it is from a very, it's from a very famous book by the Gestalt psychologist Max Wertheimer called Productive Thinking. And it's where he studied people who, how do they come up with creative solutions for problems? And one of the puzzles he studies is the so-called parallelogram problem, which is that you take students and you ask them to figure out what's the area of a parallelogram. And of course, they already know how to do the area of a rectangle. One side times the other side is the area. And so the kind of trick to it is that how you can see it is that if you see that the amount that the parallelogram juts out on one side, if you cut it off, you can put it on the other side and turn it into a rectangle.
Yeah.
And so it has an inherently visual solution, that there's a kind of perceptual act of like, oh, the part that sticks out here matches the part that fills in there. And it's a rectangle now, I can solve it. And so he talks about all these processes, these like A and B processes. The A processes are ones where you can use this trick. So I'll show it here. You can kind of overlay it for maybe the people here, but the idea being that like, this is a weird shape. So you've never learned in school how to do this shape here, but the parallelogram trick works because the out jut and the in jut are the same. And so you visually move them over. And so I think this parallelogram idea, like you need to represent it visually. Like you cannot describe it verbally. And so when I'm writing an essay and I'm talking about that, being able to draw it is very important. But you can also see how it's somewhat abstract, right? Like it's not just a little, it's not an actual concrete graph where you have some sort of thing. It's a visual manipulation. And so I like ideas like that. I often find that for ideas that don't have that sort of abstract quality, there is a sort of a metaphorical aspect to my drawing. So I use stick figures and stuff. And so, I have this article about like learning being hard and there's frustration. And I have like a stick figure and then I have some like monster thing that I drew. And so like a monster is a different, like that's a much more kind of literary metaphor where it's, it is concrete and visual, but it's visual in the sense that it represents something you could describe in words. And so I think, both of those things influence my process, but definitely adding the illustrations to my blog has been I think it fits how I think about things. It's definitely opened up how I like to convey ideas. And I think the readers have really appreciated it as well, because I think for a lot of people, they're hungry for visualizations. It's just that a lot of thinkers maybe haven't developed that artistic way of conveying ideas. And so they're kind of imprisoned a little bit into expressing ideas purely in a textual form. And so I always appreciate great thinkers like Max Wertheimer, where he actually, does draw some little pictures, or he has some pictures in this idea that express what would otherwise be, well, what are you talking about?
Well, that's really great. I think that's super helpful. And it helps me think about, again, I think I mirror this to the way I think about when I do illustration, because a lot of times when I do illustration, I get manuscript from another author. And I look through it and I try and figure out, well, how do I describe that? And my process is pretty collaborative. So yeah, I'll do sketches and bounce back and forth between the author and, it's not quite right. I think it's more like this. And sometimes we'll try multiple things to really get to the heart of it. But ultimately it's, trying to get inside the mind of the author and what they're trying to communicate. You have the advantage that you are the author and the illustrator, right? So you can know what that is pretty immediately. So it's pretty fascinating. And I think for sketchnoters especially, this could be really helpful. But I do have a huge amount of respect for people who develop the craft of conveying ideas visually, because they do have different rules than conveying things verbally. And so, even if you're starting from the same kind of, in a very abstract way, the same idea, I've had to learn a lot of things through trial and error that, I think would be great to have been taught. But things like, when you draw a graph, you really can't have too much stuff on it. Like there can be, just like a sentence can have too many clauses. You can definitely have a graph where like, there's too much going on here. It's not clear what the idea is. And so I feel like the images that I've definitely published a lot of bad images where it's sort of like, I don't know what this is a picture of. But I think there's also situations where, honing in on that kind of like, what is an image with just captures exactly the point you want to make and no more. And it doesn't have like a lot of waste, has been a kind of quest of mine. I don't always do it right, but I think there's something analogous to the writer who's looking for that sentence that just hits exactly the message you want to say. And there's not a lot of waste and, other little clauses and things like that. I think there's something very similar visually, but again, it's a different language that you have to kind of learn to speak. I would say, just speaking for me, but probably guessing that other visualizers, sketchnoters probably have the same challenge. Like there's times where like, oh man, I really nailed that. Image is perfect to communicate that idea. And then there's other ones where I got, 80% close or not exactly what I wanted, but it's conveys enough. And, the advantage of having images and words together is that the words where the images, maybe you don't have the detail, the words can fill it in. So they really kind of work together, I think.
I can even talk about like a recent challenge I had. Like I feel like one of the challenges is that sometimes you want to convey because images are often good at taking multiple relationships and just putting them in one thing. So you just see them in one object that would have to require a lot of different sentences. But sometimes it can be hard because like the amount of dimensions you have exceeds your space and this kind of thing. And so I recently have like about 40 crumpled balls of paper. I was trying to convey this idea about memory. This is from the psychologist Robert Bjork. And he has this really provocative idea that memory actually has two components. There's a storage strength and a retrieval strength. We only ever can tell the retrieval strength, but the storage strength is something that's inferred. And the idea is that the more storage strength you have, the more that you practice it, the higher it goes. But retrieval strength is kind of the reverse, that something that was very hard to retrieve, and if you successfully retrieve it, it greatly increases the retrieval strength. And this sort of is this idea behind this retrieval practice idea I was talking about earlier. But basically you have like a graph that has like these two dimensions. And then once you do some sort of practice, they go in different directions. And it was like, oh man, trying to find a way to draw that was very hard because, I can play a little movie in my head, but even just the static image is like, how do I get motion? How do I get like this turning into this other thing, which is you can do in a video format, but it's hard to do that in a static drawing. Can often be difficult. So, I mean, this is something that I struggle with, but I think just thinking about it for me, it's fundamentally a visual thing. Like it's, the verbalization doesn't really represent how I'm thinking about it.
That's really interesting. And I think maybe that means you need to step into to animation next.
Yeah.
The next challenge, right?
Oh, yeah. And I start a YouTube channel. Yeah.
Yeah. So the last question I want to ask along this line is, you sort of briefly mentioned this portrait drawing challenge.
Right.
You put yourself 30 days for I think it was portrait drawing. Tell us a little bit about that. I'm certainly going to leave a link to that class. But tell us about, why did you choose that, and what were your observations when you got done?
Right. So, I mean, it was just one of those like, why climb the mountain? Because it's there a little bit projects, because I've always been interested in art. Like we've been talking about, I always feel like I've been a visual person. I really like visual media. I like painting and drawing and doing those kind of things. And drawing faces has always felt like, especially something that's a likeness, not just a generic face, but like someone's face, has always really intrigued me because I wasn't good at it. And it was like it wasn't super clear how you'd get good at it either. Like some people just seem to, you see them draw a portrait, especially those like street side caricaturists or the street side, like, I do a portrait drawing in 5 minutes. I'm like, well, it does actually look like that person. And it's impressive. And so how are they doing that? And a little kind of idea that I think got me started on that project, although I would not give it the full credit for getting me to the end of the project, was just this idea of like, well, one of the issues is that when you're drawing, let's say faces, you don't get very good feedback about what you got wrong. It just looks wrong. You're not sure why it's wrong. Is it wrong because the eyes are too big, or because the nose is in the wrong place, or any of this kind of stuff? It's hard to say. And so the idea was, well, what if you drew pictures from other pictures? You drew portraits from photographs. And after you took a photo of it, and then you just like in Photoshop, you just overlaid it like a kind of semi-transparency. And then you can like see what it is that you're doing wrong. Like, oh, I put the eye in the wrong place, or I did this kind of thing. So this was the starting process of just like, if you just did that repeatedly, but you get better at drawing portraits. Now, it turns out the answer is somewhat. It helps a bit, but a lot of the problems that you get, I think later on, are not so much problems of like systematic errors. Like I think the average person drawing a face makes a systematic error that they put the eyes too far up in the head, because we focus on mouth, nose, and eyes. And so we imagine that it occupies most of the head, but the eyes are about halfway up the head in an average person. And so this is just sort of a systematic error that people make, but you quickly get over those systematic errors if you're getting this kind of feedback. But the problem is that you're just not accurate enough. Like sometimes you draw them too wide, sometimes you draw them too narrow. It's like our facial recognition abilities are so good that like even, a millimeter off in some facial attribute looks kind of wrong for people. It's like, that's not quite right. And so this kind of halfway through that project, I did a bunch more research of like, well, how do people draw portraits then? And I stumbled on this really great artist. I think his name is David Jamieson. And he is just like absolutely mind-blowing at like draftsmen and drawing portraits for like being realistic. And you can Google his stuff. He has an online course that he sells at Vitruvian Studio or Vitruvian Studios, I forget which one, .com. And he is just just a master draftsman. And he kind of talks about this sort of process of like seeing relationships between kind of landmark points in the face. And it's a painstaking process. It's not something you do in a few seconds. So it hasn't helped me that much in like drawing a face over 2 minutes, but I think it showed me a lot about like how people are able to achieve, extremely high levels of accuracy with drawing just by looking at something and just kind of making little assessments. And so I think anyone who's interested in maybe reaching higher levels of realism in their drawing could definitely benefit from his kind of courses. And I think it teaches a lot. He teaches a lot about, basic principles of drawing as well. So if you're interested in that, I think the kinds of cartoons that I draw on the website are maybe a little bit different from that, but I think all these different artistic experiences kind of help you at the very least gain confidence that I can actually draw pictures. So anyone who's interested, I recommend checking that out.
Something that struck me is you mentioned that we are all really good at facial recognition, that maybe the problem with portrait drawing isn't that we don't see the face, it's that we have a disconnect between our ability to see and know whether it's right or not and our drawing ability to rise to the level of what we see, right? So like it's way down here and we keep on fumbling around, and you feel satisfaction when you maybe rise close to the level of what you're able to see. And that's the challenge. And that, this relationship that you talk about that Jameson mentioned totally makes sense, right? Like, you sort of like, well, the eye is about this far from that, and there's all these balanced relationships that you have to get right, or else it just feels wrong. And you can't really understand exactly why, because you just see it, but you sort of have to build all this, not only the ability to draw, but to describe what's not quite right, it seems like.
Well, I do think, another good resources I'd recommend is Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. I thought was a good book. It's a little bit easier to get into. It's not quite as serious, maybe a technique as Jameson teaches, but the idea, I think, which is very powerful, is that we have incredible visual processing skills, but these are not skills that are consciously accessible. They're probably not even done, in a way that you could introspect, like that there's some kind of rule being applied about like where eyes go in the face. It probably isn't like that. And so I think that is a major problem with drawing generally, is that we have sophisticated visual recognition skills that allow us to quickly tell what looks realistic, what looks not realistic, but zero ability to say why. And so that's a purely trained ability to be like, what's wrong with this image is very, very difficult to tell. Even when, if you point it out, it's obvious in retrospect. It's kind of like, oh, this is much bigger than this, and it's not supposed to be. Is maybe obvious, but you're just looking at, you're like, it doesn't look right. I can't figure out why. And so I think even if you're doing kind of little like doodles, I think having some basic understandings of how drawing works at a very basic level can give you a lot of confidence. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think you need to draw great pictures by any means to communicate ideas visually. But I think that if you have some basics of like how light and shadow work and how drawing works, it helps, I think, a lot, because you can also kind of get a sense of like why certain images work and why some don't, because of, simple ideas like that. I mean, there's a lot to getting good at drawing, but I think definitely that language is again, it's a foreign language. It's the seeing images is something we know by kind of our birthright, but our ability to produce images is something you definitely have to learn with practice.
This has all really been fascinating, and thanks for sharing your wisdom and understanding and experience. I think this is going to be great for people listening and watching. And I want to shift a little bit now to we've been adding this component into podcasts for the last couple of years through the pandemic, and that is what keeps you sane in the middle of a pandemic, when you think things are normal, then lockdowns happen or you have to wear a mask, things, they seem out of our control. What are some of the things that you've done that maybe someone could take inspiration from?
Well, I mean, I always really like having a project to work on. And I think this is not just a pandemic piece of advice. It's just a general life piece of advice, that when you have a project that's under your control and it's something that you think about a lot, that gets you excited, that is something interesting, somehow all the uncontrollable stuff in the world fades into the background a little bit. And so, I've been doing this sort of major research projects. That's been having me read a lot of books. Early in the pandemic, I did a little project, which you can find on my website, where my wife was born in North Macedonia, and she speaks Macedonian, although she also speaks English fluently, and we speak English at home. And I was interested in learning her language. And so we did a little project where we were just speaking in Macedonian to each other at home. And that was a kind of little like learning project where, just learning another language. And so I think, it can be whatever you want it to be, but I think coming up with little projects that are under your control, there's something that's interesting to you, something that you want to work at, it's often helpful, I think, if they're a little bit challenging. If it's something that's just trivial, then it's either just becomes a chore or something that you don't think about, but something that you have to invest some mental energy in. And it should be fun too. Like, I'm not just suggesting you should take on more work, but I think projects are a really good way of coping with, I don't know what you said, like the essential, you look out in the news and there's all this terrible stuff that's happening that you have zero control over, and you can feel a little bit of anxiety or despair about it. But I think when you have some project of like, oh, you know what, I'm going to do a watercolor painting every day for 30 days, all of a sudden you have something that's in your power that can make you feel good about life. And so, it's just a little tip. I don't think it's the solution, but hopefully it helps.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think often we have projects, we don't think of them that way, but having something like sort of like a safe place where you can go, that's your thing. And the control is the big part of it, right? Sort of counteracts at least some elements of what you can't control. That's really valuable.
Mm-hmm. This episode of the Sketchnote Army Podcast is brought to you by Concepts, an infinite canvas sketching app built for tablets with a stylus, like the iPad Pro, Microsoft Surface, and Samsung Galaxy Tab. Concepts' infinite canvas lets you spread out and sketch in any direction. Everything you draw in Concepts is a flexible vector, so you can move your notes around the canvas or change their color, tool, or size with a simple gesture. Search Concepts in your favorite app store for infinite, flexible sketching.
So let's shift into tools. I would love to hear, maybe they're not fancy, but what are some of the analog tools? And then if you use digital tools at all, are there any digital tools that you like that you could share? Because a lot of the people will discover new tools through this part of the podcast.
Yeah. So I, as I said, I'm a real analog person. I used to, in the very early days of my blog, I used to use a photo manipulation software called GIMP. I don't know whether everyone's heard of that. That was my not being able to afford Photoshop, and that was open source. I've tried using it recently. I don't think it's as well supported, so I'm not going to sure I'm going to recommend it right now. It's a little bit kind of but there's good analogs to Photoshop. And I really used to do a lot of the early images I did on the blog. And so people can scroll way back in the archives, can find, I would do these sort of like vector art where you do the little, like you put the little dots and you sort of move the little Bezier curves. And I used to do a lot of little drawings that way on the blog. And then more recently, I've just been pen and paper. So I kind of already showed an image I have these, I'll just reach for it. I have this, this is Pilot drawing pen. This is one of the ones that I like using. It's a bit thick. I kind of like it because it has high contrast and it shows up. And I also have these, I since it became a kind of major feature on my blog, I splurged and bought like fancy pencil crayons. So these are like an expensive set of pencil crayons that have really high pigmentation. So they show up really well. But I mean, I think the basic idea though, is just that the materials aren't so important. I think, people will sometimes write to me and be like, how do you make the images? In part because I think they are kind of visually distinctive. Like it's not there, sometimes you see, oh yeah, you're using this tool because it looks like so-and-so's images that are the same. But I think most of what makes your visual stuff distinct is not, whether you're using a certain artistic tool, but how you use it and how you express ideas and stuff. And I recommend using whatever you feel most comfortable with. I think I like the sort of pen and paper stuff just because I feel like I can get the, manual dexterity and the precision in drawing things. But some people hate it because they make a mistake and then they can't erase it, and then it can be frustrating and stuff. And so, I know people that they really like Procreate or something like that, because it's like, okay, there's low stress. I can just use the pen and do it that way. So I have done some stuff with Procreate as well. I did a course with Cal Newport called Life of Focus, and we decided we wanted to have we wanted sort of like a little bit of a watercolor kind of theme. It needed to look analog, but it wanted to be kind of watercolor. And we were really struggling to find a good illustrator who could produce in that style. And eventually it was just kind of like, Scott, you should just do the images. And so I ended up doing that one in Procreate, in part because watercolor, if anyone's done it before, is an extremely frustrating medium for making mistakes and screwing it up. And I didn't have enough time to practice it to master it, but I did some stuff in that as well. So I do think Procreate can be useful for that as well. I tend to do pen and paper for my actual drawings, but I have used that before as well.
That's really great. And I love that you have just such simple tools that you're using. I think that's kind of refreshing, because the danger of having a tool section is people think, as you said, that, oh, the tool is what makes it, but I don't think it's that at all. It's exactly what you said. It's how do you use it? What's the unique way in which you use it? And then the person that's making it is, your context and everything you've learned up to that point.
Well, I think one thing that I want to stress too is that I think the reason people gravitate toward tools is they see someone who produces just brilliant work, and the actual sort of mechanism that they produce the brilliant work is just inside their head, right? And so the only thing you can see is, well, what are they doing? What tools do they have? And so there is a sort of maybe wishful thinking that if I had the tools, then my drawings would look like theirs. I think the more helpful steps is, if you're trying to produce sort of as an amateur, semi-professional, something that's actually going to be going out there and you're using it as opposed to just for your personal consumption. Things that I found helpful is learn the basics of drawing is probably helpful, just so that you know how shapes work and how lighting works and things like that. And then I think you have to, as you said, develop a kind of a visual language. So there's little details on my blog, which they're little rules that I keep for drawing things that I don't state them anywhere. They're not obvious, but if you look through, you could see them. For instance, when I draw stick figures, they never have any eyes or facial features. They're usually just head. And occasionally I will draw a mouth if they have to have a mouth, but I otherwise don't have a mouth. And that's just a particular thing. Whereas some people, every stick figure would have eyes. That's a normal thing to have on a stick figure. Or things usually if I have multiple stick figures and one is supposed to be the viewer, I use a particular color for that. And so it's sort of like a teal color. I also don't use any natural skin tones for the colors for the thing. I want it to be deliberately not I'm having that issue where it's okay, I've drawn some of them and they're a particular kind of ethnic skin color or a white person or whatever. I don't want to have that in the images, but these are little parts of the kind of visual language that I've kind of pieced together over time. And so I think as you draw more images, you get certain this is how I draw this, and this is how I draw that, and this is why I draw it this way, that I think you kind of figure out. And as you build that, because those rules are going to be yours and not someone else's, they're going to make your style look unique and on its own and stuff. And so I think that's just something that comes with practice.
That's interesting. You've almost naturally stepped into the tips section. So I would call that your tip number one, which is sort of build your own internal rules about drawing, or visual rules, I guess. Maybe that would be that would be number one. What would two other tips be that you've learned either from visualization or learning? Either one would be great.
Don't worry about your stuff not looking good, I think would be another thing. I think especially if you're not trying to produce commercially saleable art, but you're just trying to convey ideas, people, I think, they get really anxious about drawing, right? Because they don't do it a lot. My drawings aren't very good. And I feel the main lesson I got is that I had that same feeling, is that I was these images are just placeholders. And I was just really surprised how much people liked bad art, how much people liked images that were just obviously not professional quality. And so I think that's something that I would lean into, is that, getting over your anxiety about it is important, and just going out there and doing it, because most people can't draw and most people don't care about it. I think, and I think this is particularly true when you're just trying to convey an idea. I think people are more critical when you're trying to let's say, make a painting where it's trying to look realistic. But when you're just trying to draw a doodle, which is abstract or, just illustrates an idea very broadly, you can get away with a lot, is I guess what I would say.
Cool. Well, that's a really good one. What about a third tip? What might be a third one you would give?
I think the third one would relate to learning itself. And it's just the idea, to reiterate what I said earlier, which is that for a lot of abstract ideas, if you can keep in the back of your head that you're looking for a way to have a mental picture of it, I think that often directs your studying efforts or your learning efforts better than if you are just sort of like, well, how do I memorize this? And I will say, you can also turn that into an impossible problem. Like, I can't visualize it. And then it's giving you other stress. So I don't want to create that burden on you. But I think if you just keep that in the back of your head of like, this is a tool that sometimes works, of like finding a visual representation of this idea. I think that can be quite powerful. And for people who feel very comfortable with that license to use visual images to represent ideas can be incredibly powerful. So I have spent years like kind of talking about these techniques with people, and I find there's kind of two camps. There's the camp where it stresses them out because they can't find an image, and then they're like freaking out about it. And it's like, okay, well, that's just one tool that you can use. But then there's other people where it's like it clicks and it's freeing, and it's sort of like, oh yeah, okay, now I can see this image, and now when I want to recall the idea, I go back to my image, and it's easy to remember. Whereas before I wasn't doing that. I don't know why I wasn't doing that. And so I think most of my university years it was like, how do I make an image out of this, or how do I visualize what's going on? And then when people would say, well, like, how do you solve that puzzle, or how do you figure it? It's like, well, I just go back to the image, and I just like, okay. Like, as I said, with the voltage and stuff, it's like, okay, well, what's the setup here? Well, this can't be true because there'd be too much water coming out or something, like you can just kind of infer it almost. And it sounds sort of mysterious and magical, but I think that it's only something that's mysterious or magical when you can't see what they're doing, right? And you can't see that they actually have some image that they're manipulating.
These are great tips. Thanks, Scott, so much for these. And it's been just really good to have you on the show. It's been really fascinating, and I would love to send people to find you. So what are the best places to find your stuff? I assume a website and maybe some other places.
So highly recommend people go to my website, scotthyoung.com, and they can view my very non-professional images, and they can see that. And you can also check out my book, Ultralearning. It's, as we were talking about earlier, it's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy your books. It's also Audible. So if you like listening such as in a podcast and you're not sick of listening to my voice, you can listen to the book as well. And I talk about a lot of things that are not visually related in that book, and principles of memory, understanding subjects, and, practicing practical skills and things like this. So I think if you're interested in, how learning works, and you're interested in maybe some kind of a little bit off the wall ideas about how you might be able to do it better, then, maybe it's worth your time.
Wow, that's really great. Thanks so much for being on the show, Scott. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and experience with us. And for everyone watching the show, this will be another episode of the Sketchnote Army Podcast. Until our next episode, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
The Sketchnote Army Podcast was created by me, Mike Rohde, and brought to you by Rohde Design Studios. It's produced and edited by Alec Polianis of AMP Creative Studios. The theme music was created by John Schiedermeyer. To support the creation of this show, I invite you to buy one of my books, the Sketchnote Handbook or the Sketchnote Workbook. You can find the books on Amazon, or go to peachpit.com and use the code ROHDE40 for 40% off. Please share this podcast with other visual thinking friends, and be sure to leave a nice rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast listening app so others can find the show.